great. So my name is Gwendŵr, and I will be talking to you about the role of collaboration after ecosystem disturbance. In this case, wildfire, the 2015 soda fire. And this research was recently published in Rangelands. So if your interest is piqued by this talk, you can also look at that paper for more detail. And as many of you are aware, and we've heard from other speakers earlier today, we're increasingly seeing more frequent wildfires, and they're becoming much bigger. So fire at natural return intervals is a healthy part of the ecosystem, but wildfires, when fuel loading is high, can lead to adverse conditions such as soil sterilization, hydrophobicity of those soils, accelerated runoff and erosion, and then subsequent conversion of native grass shrub communities to non-native annual grassland, dominated in this case by cheatgrass. So there have historically always, to some extent, been large range fires, but the current era of mega fires that we're experiencing in the Great Basin is unprecedented. And with increasingly large fires, it's more likely that those fires are going to cross jurisdictional boundaries, and you'll need to collaborate with other entities. So in this case, I'm talking about wildfire, but other disturbances like non-native species invasions do the same thing in terms of crossing jurisdictional boundaries freely. Like this fire did, the Murphy fire that burned approximately 652,000 acres in 2007. The Long Draw fire here in southeastern Oregon that burned over 557,000 acres in 2012. And in 2018, the Martin fire in north central Nevada, burning 435,000 plus acres. And I would be remiss without mentioning some of the ongoing wildfires, going on this year. For instance, the Caldor and Dixie fires. And I mean, these are burning forest more than rangeland, so they're not the focus of my presentation today, but they do certainly showcase in kind of horrifying detail how regimes are changing. But the fire that I'm talking to you about today is smaller than these, but still quite a large fire. And that's the soda fire that burned in August of 2015, approximately 280,000 acres, 50,000 acres of which were priority greater sage-grouse habitat. And a good amount of the rest of that acreage, 191,000, was important habitat for greater sage-grouse. Within the burn perimeter, there were also 41 grazing allotments, 3 wild horse management areas, and a popular recreation area. And so this map on the left shows the 2016 vegetation treatments. This vertical line here down the map is the state border between Oregon on the left and Idaho on the right. The yellow color is BLM land, and the blue boxes are state trust lands, that checkerboard pattern. So in Boise, if you look in the lower right of the map, is approximate enough, certainly for smoke and visibility problems. So to tell the story, it's important to provide a little bit of context, especially the federal policy context. On January 5th of 2015, then Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, signed Executive Order 3336, which calls for improved coordination in addressing rangeland wildfire and its impacts on wildlife, recreation, and economic activity. The order explicitly mentioned conserving habitat for sagebrush steppe dependent species such as greater sage-grouse. So it's important to keep this in mind when I get to my results, because the soda fire rehabilitation effort occurred at a special time between the executive order and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's sage-grouse listing decision deadline on September 30th of that year. So going into this project, my overarching research objectives were really, how was collaboration being coordinated after a wildfire that crossed administrative boundaries? But to get there, I needed to kind of break that into separate, smaller parts. looking at what collaborations existed on the soda fire lands, those that burned during the soda fire, both before and after the fire, resulting from the wildfire, but also collaborations that started up as the rehabilitation efforts started winding down. Whether the collaboration was more event-driven, a result of the wildfire itself, or whether it was more a part of the sociopolitical context, climate, and whether it was more of a new management paradigm, and how successful the collaborative rehabilitation was as perceived by managers, how successful the collaboration itself was. So to do this, I conducted semi-structured key informant interviews from November 2018 to March of 2019 with folks from state and federal agencies, NGOs, local government, and private landowners. And then I used thematic analysis to systematically code data for patterns and extract major emergent themes, and also did a network visualization of their collaborative relationships. So next we'll get into a little bit of the results. So these symbols represent the individuals that I spoke with, except for the private landowners in Jordan Valley Cooperative Weed Management Area. They don't really have a snazzy insignia, so I just wrote their names down. But there were essentially 3 management processes occurring at once, those on private, state, and federal lands. And because of various MOUs in place, the collaboration between state and federal lands was, pretty cohesive. A lot of these same, the same organizations, sometimes different individuals, were collaborating with each other between state and federal land. So there wouldn't really be those like donut holes of land left out of the management. And the USGS was working closely with the BLM on federal lands to work on monitoring the rehabilitation. It's kind of a different story on private lands, and with the BLM unable to really fund private lands rehabilitation, other agencies coordinated assistance to landowners like the Office of Species Conservation, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coordinated with NRCS so that they could contribute towards a cost share for spraying the first year. And the NRCS could do the same for seeding the following year on private lands. However, few landowners ended up really applying for this assistance, largely because they needed their private lands to feed cattle, since their grazing allotments on federal and state lands had burned and required rest. But also there were some trust issues at play as well. So these networks show who worked together on private, state, and federal lands. This is just showing collaboration resulting from the soda fire, not those before or once the rehabilitation efforts started winding down. And the big yellow node here in each kind of network represents the primary decision maker on those lands. And these networks aren't quite what I expected as a result, but maybe that's a good thing. Interviewees basically said that they did work with all of these actors, at each of these levels. But what's not shown here is really the strength of those connections, and that's what really varied. And one note here is that the Oregon BLM is kind of shown as an offshoot. It's maybe not as bad as it looks. It was more that they were in constant communication with Idaho BLM as to what they were doing on that rehabilitation, but ultimately needed to kind of prioritize different areas. There was another fire going on, and they worked together, but kind of worked together separately, kind of thing. And another, I guess, caveat here is like Idaho Department of Lands is ultimately the kind of entity in charge, but they're also kind of constrained by BLM parcels surrounding their lands. They're probably not going to go out and do something management widely differing because their land parcels are all scattered and non-adjacent. So a really simple question, well, I don't know if it's simple, but the results are presented that way at least, is how my interviewees perceived the success of the collaborative effort. And of those that responded to that question, they were very consistent on a scale from 0 to 100, with 50 being neutral. The mean, median, and mode of response was 70. So better than status quo management generally, but again, not, pie in the sky ideal. And, here are some quotes from interviewees that kind of give a better picture than that graph really can of what the rehabilitation collaboration was like. So the state of collaboration is obviously nuanced. So all these individuals have slightly different takes on it. Like this Idaho Department of Fish and Game employee mentions that they really saw it as a new era in management. Whereas this Idaho State Department of Ag employee mentions that sometimes they felt they were being updated, but it was definitely better than what they normally get. And in comparison, the Oregon BLM employee that mentioned that there was a different emphasis on the Oregon and Idaho side. So getting both sides on the same page in terms of importance was kind of a challenge from the beginning. However, in one of the outcomes was that in learning about each other, collaborators were able to garner a better understanding of agency processes other than their own. So some participants mentioned something similar to what this NRCS employee said. I think we all learned quite a bit because we didn't know how the BLM did it before, and so now it makes more sense. We have a little better understanding of how the process works, and that can better facilitate a better partnership. And that's kind of related to this other outcome that folks mentioned, that where relationships forged during collaborations like the wildfire rehabilitation response go on to be repurposed for new aims. So, repurposed relationships, meaning those relations that kind of change and evolve as needs and priorities shift. Like what this USGS employee mentions, that things will kind of morph and we'll work on some of the same kind of themes, but in new contexts. It won't be like a comprehensive response to a specific fire. It might be specific control options for cheatgrass or studying the effectiveness of fuel breaks. And this was also evidenced in what someone from Oregon BLM mentioned, that a lot of the collaboration that helped them with the soda fires, helping them with Tri-State. And that's a reference to the Tri-State Fuel Break Project. It's a large scale network of fuel breaks across parts of Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada. And the only collaborative project that was mentioned both before, the only one that wasn't mentioned, both before and after the soda fire was a targeted grazing project for fuel breaks, basically in the footprint of the soda fire, to try to make sure that it doesn't burn again or in the same total footprint. Other than that, a lot of the collaborations both before and after related to the same things, so sage grouse, habitat management, spraying of invasives, and juniper removal. So lastly, I'm going to end on what managers put forth as opportunities for increasing collaboration on large multi-scale projects like wildfire rehabilitation or invasive species. And I think this quote from a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employee sums it up well. The agencies are not built to handle long-term commitments. The personnel, the funding streams aren't well adapted for that. So we need to change some of that, but the individuals need to try and take ownership for the long-term too. I think if we expect more individually, that we can each individually make a difference. So to conclude, there was certainly a perceived need for large-scale collaboration following the soda fire. However, that collaboration, I'm using that term very broadly, and when you think about the nuances between cooperation, collaboration, and coordination, the soda fire effort was more effectively a large-scale coordination effort. Collaboration is really more about dispersed leadership with equal risk sharing by all entities. Just like to make that caveat there. You could certainly, I don't have time to go into it, make a case that coordination is more effective at this scale. I'll leave it at that. But so there is still opportunity, particularly between the states, in this case, Idaho and Oregon, integrating collaboration. And then cooperating or coordinating with private landowners was still difficult. So lastly, I mean, collaboration is going to ebb and flow with changing needs, whether that's large scale wildfire or with the socio-political climate at the time, either changing the perceived need for collaboration or what those collaborations will focus on. But the good news is that forming collaborations about resource issues can create connections between managers that may become kind of latent, not super active, but as new needs arise, perhaps for another wildfire, juniper removal, trying to get rid of non-native annual grasses, those latent connections can be reactivated. And that's where the last quote I read comes in. You know, one way to interpret this is not to think of top-down restrictions or mandates, but to seek collaboration with other land managers as a bottom-up force of change that can incrementally nudge the institutional system. So thank you. I know I'm over time.